Please join me in welcoming Jessica Whitehead.
Thanks, you all. I'm so happy to be back here in Maysville. I was here with the KMHA conference last year, and it was so fun to be here, and that was my first time visiting Maysville and visiting this wonderful facility. You have such a great place here, such a great community here, and I'm proud to be able to bring the story of Harlan and Anna Hubbard to you here. They have a special connection to Maysville, which we'll talk about in this presentation. But just out of curiosity, I always like to poll my audiences. Who here has heard of Harlan and Anna Hubbard before? Sweet. Who has read a book by Harlan Hubbard before? All right. So we're going to be learning lots today, aren't we? This is great. This is really fun, particularly because Harlan Hubbard, who I'll just give you the Cliff's Notes version before we dive in here, is an author, he's an artist, and he was a sustainability advocate before it was really hot to be a sustainability advocate. You heard him referred to as Kentucky's Thoreau in Dr. Taylor's blurb there. That's referring, of course, to Henry David Thoreau, who wrote Walden, which, of course, is a masterpiece of American individualism, a masterpiece of Transcendentalism. Harlan Hubbard is sort of the Kentucky answer to Walden and to the story of Henry David Thoreau, and people who wanted to live an alternative life closer to nature and away from the rat race that we're all sort of part of, willingly or unwillingly right now. So just a little background on me. I was never fortunate enough to meet either Harlan Hubbard or his wife Anna. Everything that I've learned about Harlan Hubbard has been through the incredible legacy that he and his wife Anna left behind. And that legacy comes in the forms of people who did meet him, so speaking to people who knew him well, who were friends with him, speaking to descendants and family members, seeing the huge collection of letters and manuscripts that were left behind in other archives, and of course, viewing his incredible oeuvre of artwork and the beautiful structures that he's built in Kentucky that I will talk to you about as well. And one of the first of those artifacts is actually the painting that's featured on this postcard here. And if you don't have a postcard handy, it's this painting right here. Have any of you been to Hanover College in southern Indiana? Okay, so this is the view, the beautiful view of the Ohio River, the bends in the Ohio River from Hanover College, where I attended undergraduate school. And this painting used to sit behind the circulation desk in the library while I was a student there. I was an art history student, so of course I was very attracted to this painting. I was very attracted to any painting I saw on campus. But this one, of course, I knew the view. I knew nothing, however, about the artist who had signed down in the corner in red paint, Harlan Hubbard. I didn't know anything about this guy. And so when it came time for me to do a culminating project for my art history degree, I decided, okay, I love this painting. I feel very drawn to this painting. I feel very drawn into this painting. I want to find out what this painting's about and who Harlan Hubbard is. And I started to do a little research, and I uncovered, wow, he had written books. Wow, Hanover College has more than 30 paintings of his. Wow, Hanover College has 30 paintings of probably 1,000 painting oeuvre that he has made over the course of his lifetime. Wow, he built this home called Payne Hollow nearby Hanover College that was this absolute mecca for people during the 60s, 70s, and 80s who were trying to understand an alternative way to live in this world. I discovered so much about this person, and of course it became a huge part of my life. I graduated in 2011. Since 2011, I have been studying Harlan Hubbard ever since, and this is sort of the culminating project of all of that work since then. We're going to come back to this painting at the end, and I'll tell you why. But first, I sort of want to orient you to why the book is called what it's called, why it's called Driftwood, kind of a strange title for a biography. Normally biographies are just the name of the person that is being talked about in the biography. Well, Driftwood is actually an homage to the title of Harlan Hubbard's first breakout book. That's a book called Shantyboat that you may have heard of, you may not have heard of. But he published a book called Shantyboat in 1953 that became a little bit of a sensation, and we'll talk about why. But his initial title for that publication was Driftwood. And so my title for my book is sort of an homage to his original title for his first book. But it's also talking about what the idea philosophically Driftwood can mean in Harlan Hubbard's life, what it means in our lives. It's been particularly interesting during this season of historic flooding of the Ohio River in this region and in regions all along the Ohio River Valley to be rolling this book out, because this book actually begins during the 1937 flood, which of course was one of the most catastrophic floods in the history of the Ohio River, recorded history of the Ohio River, and was a flood that was just one of many floods that Harlan Hubbard had witnessed within his life and had had a deep philosophical impact on the way he thought about life, about the course of his life. And we meet Harlan Hubbard at the beginning of my book, as I said, in 1937. This is in the middle of his life, and one thing I really like to stress to history lovers, I know so many of you are history lovers here, Harlan Hubbard was born in 1900. Boy, does it make my job easy, because I never have to do math to know what age he is. So in 1937, Harlan Hubbard is 37. He is restless. He is dissatisfied with his life. He is living with his mother in Fort Thomas, Kentucky, which is across the river from Cincinnati. And he has been living with her and taking care of her for his entire life. He is unmarried. He doesn't have much of a career to speak of, at least not what he was looking forward to. And so when we meet him, the idea of a river flood speaks to him in a really visceral way. And he actually writes in his journal in the 1930s, he says, "I've been affected by this rise of water. It suggested primeval times when the earth was being made. It separated the earth from the works of man. I saw my true dwelling place. I need a flood in my soul to carry off all the old drift and flimsy habits that have extended down to the water's edge. It will come, causing suffering and loss. But if it does not come, the river will become stagnant, filled with growth and mud." And I think this journal entry really speaks to where Harlan Hubbard was in the 1930s. He was, and perhaps somewhere where we've all been in our lives before, not really sure what our next big thing is, not really sure where to go, what to do. And it's sort of an unfamiliar glimpse of someone who would go on to become a Kentucky luminary in Kentucky history and Kentucky culture. But before we talk anymore about that, we have to go back to the beginning to tell you a little bit about where Harlan Hubbard came from and some of the forces that started to create him into this person that we're meeting at the beginning of this book. Harlan was born in Bellevue, Kentucky. So I mentioned Fort Thomas, Bellevue, Covington, Newport, all of these little strings of river towns that are right there along the Ohio River in northern Kentucky, across from Cincinnati. Harlan grew up in Bellevue. He was born on January 4th, 1900. And on the screen here, you're seeing Harlan's parents. This is Frank Gilbert Hubbard and Rose Ann Swingle. And the two of them actually met not in Kentucky, they met in Champaign, Illinois. They met in Champaign, Illinois when Frank, does this have a, yes, when Frank was working for Rose's brother at a furniture factory. And they met when Rose was actually working too. And it's important to note, they met in the 1890s. So Rose was a working independent woman in the 1890s, a single working independent woman, and she was working for the Champaign Daily Gazette as a typesetter. And she was very proud of being a working woman, very proud of being someone who was independent. And I think she really had ambitions to be maybe a journalist or a writer, and she looked at typesetting as sort of that leg up into that world. What's not clear is why when Frank came along, she decided to get married and give all that up. And I say that not because, I'm sure Frank was a lovely guy, but they weren't very well suited to one another. They had very different ambitions, they had very different characters, they had very different hopes and dreams. And Harlan never went so far as to say that his childhood was unhappy because of this, but certainly became a point of fascination for Harlan to understand. Many of you are probably genealogists trying to understand your own families. I know that's a big thing that your museum center here does for your community. Harlan loved to dig into his genealogy and try and understand the difference between the Hubbard temperament that came from his father's side and the Swingle temperament that came from his mother's side. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But when Harlan arrived in 1900, Frank Gilbert and Rose already had two other much older sons. It's likely there were some miscarriages in between the middle son and Harlan. But when Harlan came around, Frank Lafayette Hubbard, who is right here, they're a good-looking bunch, aren't they? So Frank Lafayette Hubbard was born in 1887. Lucian Swingle Hubbard here was born exactly 2 years later to the day in 1889. And both of them were already well into their schooling. They already had a pretty good idea of what they wanted to do with their lives, what their interests were. And so it makes sense that Harlan, who's over here, little Harlan, his interests and ambitions were colored by his much older brothers. And so Frank, the eldest brother, wanted to be an artist. Louis, the middle brother, wanted to be a writer. And Harlan would go on to become both. So they definitely had an impact on the way Harlan developed. Frank and Louis also developed in Harlan another really essential interest that would come to inform his later life. All three Hubbard brothers were absolutely river rats. And of course, any self-respecting boy or girl who was growing up along the Ohio River in the 1900s was a river rat. So you were learning to canoe, you were camping, you were swimming in the Ohio, you were checking out, and this will matter later, checking out those really interesting houseboat and shantyboat communities that were all along the Ohio River in the 1900s. Harlan, this again will come back later, also learned to build boats with his brothers. So this says our canoe. This is literally a canoe that the three boys built together when they were very young. And Frank, who would write to Harlan in the 1970s to his brother, he told his brother, "You came to love the river when you were no taller than our canoe paddle," which I think is a very cute turn of phrase. But in his brother Frank, Harlan found this kindred artist, this kindred creative spirit. Both Frank and Harlan were very sensitive and curious observers of the world around them. And more than just enjoying their time outdoors and exploring, they also spent their time sketching. And Frank was really Harlan's very first art teacher. Frank, in 1906, graduated from the Ohio Mechanics Institute in Cincinnati. He had ambitions to become an illustrator. He wanted to be a commercial illustrator or some sort of illustrator doing illustrations for different books and publications, things like that. And so he was a very accomplished draftsman. He was also colorblind, which is probably another reason why he was heading more toward drawing and etching and things like that, because painting wasn't really going to be his bag. But through drawing and printmaking, Frank found this wonderful talent. Both of the works that you're looking at here on the screen are by Harlan's brother, Frank. And actually this is a drawing of little Harlan, 6 years old in 1906, learning to draw from his brother. A very meta image of his brother drawing, which is fun. But Harlan also would travel around with Frank, who was very interested in river culture, and often sketched shantyboats, sketched the beautiful bridges, sketched steamboats, and sketched those river communities that would become important to Harlan Hubbard's later artwork as well. But I mentioned we'd come back to Harlan's father, because in 1907, Harlan's father fell ill and died. He had been working as a paint salesman, and when he wasn't very good at being a salesman, he began applying paint, became a house painter. There's some speculation that some of his health conditions came from lead poisoning from applying paint for so many years. But 1907, Frank Hubbard dies. Of course, Harlan is 7, so he was quite young when his father died. But even so, he formed some impressions of his father, and through his brothers formed some impressions of his father that really spoke to how his character would develop in the future. Because one of the key tensions in the marriage of Harlan's parents was that Frank Hubbard was perfectly fine being a house painter. He didn't care to have any more financial gain in his life. He didn't care to have any more social gain in his life. He was perfectly happy to go on being a house painter. Rose Hubbard, Harlan's mother, was not so into him being a house painter. She did have lots of ambition. She did want to be a social climber. She wanted to have a life with greater comforts than a house painter could provide her. From Rose's perspective, Frank, when he died, seems maybe a little pathetic, a little doomed. But Harlan and his brothers never saw their father that way. And in fact, Harlan writes of his father in a way that would be very prescient for what we'll then learn of how Harlan's life continues. He says, "If our father were living today, he could be more true to himself and suffer less in spirit. Public opinion has become more lenient to the Hubbard temperament. The importance of worldly success, the struggle for ever higher standards of living, the ideas of progress and increasing bigness of man's dominion over nature, once as unquestioned as the Bible, are all becoming suspect now that the environmental disaster brought about by a rash and selfish application of technology is realized. No one that I know has chosen to give away his worldly goods, but there is a new incentive to do so, an added honor and integrity to voluntary poverty. It is the rich who waste the earth." And as I said, this will come back to figure later in Harlan's life. But Frank Gilbert Hubbard's death was a big transition for the family. Because even in his meager way, Frank had been the provider for his family. Fortunately, for Rose and Harlan, both of the eldest brothers, the eldest Hubbard brothers, Frank and Louis, were doing very well. They were succeeding in these careers that they had hoped to achieve in. Louis had been working for several years as a reporter in newspapers out of Cincinnati, out of Chicago, out of New Orleans. So he was traveling all around. He was covering important political events. And actually in 1912, he got the opportunity to be an editor at the New York Times. And so he moved to New York to work for the New York Times, and he actually had a byline writing a news story about the sinking of the Titanic, which is very fascinating. Louis was doing quite well. Frank was also working as an illustrator, particularly for Cincinnati area publications. And of course, after Louis moved to New York, Frank was hearing all kinds of good things about opportunities in New York for illustration. This is, of course, the age of Madison Avenue and the great rise of the madmen, and that world that needed illustrators, that needed people who were very skilled draftsmen to create and churn out these different advertisements that were needed. This was also a huge time for publishing in New York as well. So opportunities were rife for Frank. So then Frank decides to move to New York. And of course, poor Rose, who was not working, and little Harlan, who was still quite young, still a teenager, preteen even, they really depended on Frank and Louis for support, so they also moved to New York. And basically, Harlan and Rose divided their time between New York and Kentucky. They spent their fall and winter in New York for Harlan's schooling, and then in spring and summer they would return to Kentucky so Rose could keep her social calendar and keep up with her friends. And they had all settled within walking distance of each other in a neighborhood in the Bronx called Tremont. And Harlan loved exploring this new environment because, of course, even though he was leaving the Ohio River and the Licking River, he was getting to explore the Hudson River and the East River and the Harlem River and all of these incredible new landscapes that were bringing incredible inspiration to him. During this period, he was also, as I mentioned, continuing his education. So he attended Evander Childs High School in Tremont. He especially excelled at classical studies, so Latin and Greek, both the language and the literature of Latin and Greek. He loved the poet Virgil. He would translate Virgil and Ovid for the rest of his life. And he was a very adept translator as well, very good with languages. But Harlan was getting another kind of education too, because he was very close, of course, with his eldest brother, Frank. But Frank had also recently married a woman and fellow artist named Frances. Frank and Frances, that's nice. So Frank and Frances had gotten married in 1915, around when Harlan and Rose moved to New York. And both of them took Harlan very seriously. They thought that Harlan had a lot of potential. They saw what a sensitive and creative soul he was, how intelligent he was, and so they wanted to foster what they saw in this young man. And so, of course, they were in New York City at a time that was an incredible time to be in New York City. So they took him to all of the concerts that were available, all of the exhibits that were available. They even went to go to avant-garde, tiny little galleries where they could see that newfangled stuff called modernism coming out of Europe that everybody was up in an uproar about. This was a time when Harlan was getting a really important cultural education that would go on to feed his interest in following the course of art history and following the course of music throughout his entire life. But of course, this was also wartime. This was World War I. And because both Louis and Frank, Harlan's brothers, were not only supporting their mother and youngest brother, but also now had families of their own, they were able to get draft deferments for World War I. Harlan was still too young to serve in World War I. However, he could serve in a program that had been instituted by New York State called the Farm Cadet Service. And the Farm Cadet Service was a really cool opportunity for very high-achieving students, of which Harlan was one, very high-achieving high school boys, to go to upstate New York and to help fill in for all of the young men who had been drafted into World War I and were now fighting in Europe. There was a real problem in rural communities all over the United States because they had lost much of their farm help because so many young men had gone to Europe. So they were bringing in these men who weren't yet eligible for the draft in to work in their stead. Harlan applied for this program, and he, for 2 summers, went up to upstate New York to work for the Farm Cadet Service. And this was a really formative time for him, because up until this point, he had had some experience with the country, but really he was a city boy. He had grown up in town most of the time, and then certainly when he was living in the Bronx, he was in town. So Harlan was learning some skills that he had never learned before. So he was learning about how to rotate crops and how to plant and harvest crops. He was learning how to use tools, heirloom skills that were needed to use tools like a scythe, something that nobody's taught anymore, how to use a scythe properly, but that would figure very importantly in Harlan's later life, which we'll talk about. But he was learning all of these important skills, and you're actually looking at a really important discovery, one of my favorite discoveries that I made while I was writing this biography. This essay that you see on the screen is actually Harlan's culminating essay that he had to write in order to get school credit for working in the Farm Cadet Service. So this is from 1918. It is the oldest extant composition of Harlan Hubbard's that we have, which is really cool. And the New York State Archives are the housers of the Farm Cadet Service archive, and they had listed that they had some of these culminating essays, and so I messaged them and I said, hey, you don't by any chance have anything to do with Harlan Hubbard, do you? And they said, Well, in fact, we do, and voila, this incredible piece. This is special not only because this was such a formative time for Harlan, but also we can start to see some of his poetry coming out in the way that he has written this. And this essay is reproduced in full in the book, if you're curious. But you can see some of his acumen as a writer coming out already in this 1918 essay. What's also important about this time upstate, Harlan took out a book from the library in upstate New York, a little book called Walden by Henry David Thoreau. This is the first time that he ever read Walden. It would change his life. It is something that would become a foundational text for everything that he would then do later on in his life. Now, once Harlan returned from the Farm Cadet Service and had graduated high school, Frank, who of course was an artist, wanted Harlan to become an artist. And so he said, "Harlan, what are you going to do next?" And Harlan said, "I don't know." And Frank said, "Well, I think that you should go to art school." And Harlan said, "All right, I'll try it." It was probably more excited than that, but it's more fun to do it that way. So Harlan decided to get this more formal artistic education at a place called the National Academy of Design in New York. And the National Academy of Design was still a very conservative classical art institution, which meant that basically Harlan spent his time in school the first year sketching plaster busts of Greek and Roman statuary. Not terribly exciting, but certainly something Harlan excelled at because he was such a great draftsman and he had already learned so many wonderful drawing skills from his brother Frank. Frank, of course, continued to be an educational force in other ways, though. So while Harlan was at school sketching plaster casts, he was then at home with Frank learning how to use watercolor for the first time. This is his first watercolor. Learning to use oil paints for the first time. This is his first oil painting that he ever created. Both of these were done under the tutelage of his brother Frank. So Frank was a huge force in his art education. And then later that year, Harlan finally graduated from painting plaster casts to painting the real deal, painting the human figure, which of course is the next step that you take in a classical art education. And what's interesting is that in Harlan's artwork, figure studies are very rare, very, very rare. He would go on to become mainly a landscape painter. You saw this kind of artwork. This is what we think of when we think of a Harlan Hubbard. We do not think of this when we think of Harlan Hubbard. So this is a really cool piece that shows how adept he could have been at being a figure painter. But certainly this was also an important time because this is the first time he ever saw a woman without her clothes on. So this was pretty formative for him and other reasons too. While he was also, of course, still in New York studying the artworks that were available to him in museums and galleries. This is a sketchbook page from his New York sketchbook where you see he's practicing some figure studies and compositional studies by an artist named James Abbott Neal Whistler. You know Whistler's mother, I'm sure. These are some of Whistler's other paintings. This is his Symphony in White, which you might recognize, the woman dressed in her long white gown standing on a bearskin rug. Whistler would go on to become a really important force in Harlan's artistic understanding of the world. These are two early pieces from the last years Harlan spent in New York. This is Old Madison Square Garden that used to be an opera house in New York. So this is a very atmospheric rendering of people leaving the opera in the evening by carriages. This is a lovely seascape of the East River that he did. And this is one of James Abbott Neal Whistler's most famous pieces that caused a whole uproar because it was so modern. But you can see that Harlan is taking this idea of using color and shape and just a hint of form to render a full scene, something that Whistler was already doing a lot of. But by 1921, Rose was tired of New York. And when Rose was tired of something, Harlan had to be tired of something. And so Rose said she was tired of New York. Both Louis and Frank were doing really well. They had children of their own now. They had these families of their own, and she felt like it was time for them to return to Kentucky. And of course, Harlan understood that his older brothers had supported him and his mother for the first 21 years of his life. And I think he understood to some degree that it was his turn to take care of Mom. So Harlan and Rose moved back to Kentucky. They moved to Fort Thomas. And this was a tough time for Harlan because he had been exposed to so many incredible things in New York. He had learned so many incredible things in New York. And he felt a little stunted when he returned to Kentucky, not quite sure what to do, not quite sure what life held for him. And he actually wrote in this period, "Arrived in Kentucky, I was depressed and at loose ends." And I think to a degree he recognized that he was living one of the most famous lines from his favorite book, Walden, which is, "The mass of men live lives of quiet desperation." He was desperately quiet as well. And despite this dissatisfaction, he was still very productive in this period. He did enroll at the Art Academy of Cincinnati for a short period of time, but he ultimately said, art school's not for me, I'm a maverick, I'm going to go my own way. So he ended up leaving the Art Academy and just continued to study the work of other artists on his own and develop his own style. He experimented widely. You can see how different these two painting styles are, and these were done almost exactly in the same year. So he's experimenting wildly with technique, with color, but you can also see how beautifully he's learning to render his beloved Ohio River, which would become his main subject in almost all of his artwork moving forward. What he was doing when he wasn't painting was actually working as a contractor. He was working as a building contractor, and he was learning lots of really interesting trades like masonry. He was learning how to build frames. He was learning how to set windows. He was learning how to bricklay. He was learning all kinds of really fascinating things. And eventually, in 1923, after a couple years of working as a contractor, he said to his mom, "Hey Mom, let's stop renting a house. Why don't you let me design and build us a house?" And so he did. And this is Harlan around this period at a construction site. And Harlan designed and built this beautiful house. This is on at 129 Highland Avenue in Fort Thomas, if you're familiar with Fort Thomas. And we'll talk about this property a little bit more, but this structure still stands, still looks almost exactly the same as it does. And in this structure, you can already see some of the design touches that we'll see later on in his most important buildings that we'll talk about. But in this period, I have to talk about his middle brother, Louis, again, because Harlan and Rose end up taking a bunch of trips out to California. And they're taking trips out to California because Louis decided that he wasn't going to write for newspapers anymore. That wasn't good enough, because Louis was a little bit ambitious, like their mother. Louis said, "I want to write for this newfangled thing called motion pictures." And so he had started to write treatment scripts for Pathé and for other film companies that were headquartered in New York while he was still there. But of course, if you want to be in the film industry, you got to go to California. So he and his family moved to California in the mid-1920s. This is Louis with their mother, Rose, outside of his Beverly Hills mansion because things were going very well for Louis. And in fact, Rose and Harlan came out to stay for an extended period of time at this house in 1926 and 1927 because Louis was going down to be on set for a little film called Wings, of which he was producing. Wings, of course, would go on to become the very first Academy Award winner. So things were going great for Louis. Things were going really well. Rose loved this. Rose thought this was the best. This was the culmination of everything she had wanted for her life. And she was getting a little taste of it through her son. Harlan really disliked the superficiality of Hollywood. He really disliked, even though he got to meet people like Gary Cooper and Charlie Chaplin, which would be pretty cool, he preferred to go out into the desert and paint the wilderness. And this is a really beautiful watercolor that he made out west that I particularly love. Now, when Harlan and Rose returned home in 1927, maybe Harlan was a little inspired to make a bigger success of his situation. He didn't want what Lily had, but he did want his own success. And so he was continuing to experiment with style. You can see the style that he was using in the late 1920s was actually verging very close into modernism, which is something he would later on say that he absolutely hated, but he didn't. This is a very rare self-portrait of Harlan from this era, where he looks a little restless, wouldn't you say? A little dissatisfied. And one of the things he knew he needed was he needed a studio that was away from his bedroom at home. He had just been painting in his bedroom at home, and that wasn't going to work for him. He needed to be closer to nature. He needed to do what Thoreau had been telling him to do, to get out into nature and to experience nature and to put that into his creative output. And so those of you, certainly you live in Maysville, so you know the beautiful northern Kentucky hilly landscape. That beautiful northern Kentucky hilly landscape is in Fort Thomas as well, and the surrounding environs. And those huge hills along the river up there below Fort Thomas are places where he established two different studios in the 1930s. And they were out in the wilderness, they were close to the river, they were close to these river communities where he was making buddies with all of these shantyboaters and railroad workers and woodworkers and people who were farmers working close to the land, people who were better aligned with what he wanted in life. So he could get away from town, get away from the life that he was helping make possible for his mother, which was very different than the life that he actually wanted. And he was also, of course, falling back in love with the countryside of northern Kentucky. But he still wasn't making great success as an artist. He still hadn't sold paintings. He wasn't showing at galleries. But a little opportunity came along in the late 1920s, early 1930s, prompted by the Great Depression. So in the Great Depression, the government instituted lots of cultural programs to help support artists and other creators during the Great Depression and try and uplift certain kinds of art within the United States. In 1934, the government instituted something called the Public Works of Art Project, which was the predecessor to the WPA, which you will have heard of. And the Public Works of Art Project was a national project to, like I said, uplift American artists by commissioning them to create public works of art in banks, in community centers, in libraries, in theaters, that would be patriotic and uplifting and would tell the American story in a meaningful way. And the project's theme was called the American Scene, which is a phrase that would then be adopted by the group later called the regionalists. So people like Thomas Hart Benton and Grant Wood, painters like that. This is a Thomas Hart Benton painting. Again, not necessarily the style you would associate with somebody who was a landscape painter, but it was the style of the era. And Harlan saw this as an opportunity to maybe, even though he was doing something that would be a challenge to him, maybe break into the local art scene. He was actually approached by the regional commissioner to paint some commissions for the area in Fort Thomas and Covington and those areas. And he unsuccessfully tried to convince the regional chairman to let him paint a steamboat mural. That's what he really wanted to do. The regional chairman said, "Nah, we need to see something a little bit closer to the brief. We need to see something that's more patriotic." And so this is one of the things that we got from Harlan for this. This is a really interesting mural. Was not one of Harlan's favorite works that he ever did in his life. But this is a really interesting mural that Harlan completed for the Carnegie Theater in Covington. And this is a proscenium arch mural. It features Mary Draper Ingalls, Simon Kenton, Daniel Boone, and John G. Carlyle. Those are the figures that he chose to paint, along with this sort of spectral figure up here that he just simply called the Spirit of Covington. So this mural is called the Spirit of Covington. At a certain point in his life, Harlan actually said, it would be fine with me if this building just collapsed into rubble. That was sort of his feeling about this painting. But however philosophically unfulfilled he felt about this work and 4 other paintings he was commissioned to do in a similar style for local libraries, it netted him about $665 from the federal government, which was a big deal in 1934. That was pretty great for him, who had never sold a painting. And in fact, this put a little bit of pep in his step, put a little recognition into his name, and he would go on in 1935 and 1936 to have his first solo gallery exhibitions in Cincinnati. So this did have a big impact on his career, his early career, even though they were not his favorite works that he ever completed. So I mentioned he had 2 studios that were in the hills above, near Fort Thomas. But Rose, his mother, who he was still supporting, who he was still living with, by 1938, so Harlan Hubbard was 38. Rose was growing older, she was growing infirm, and the studios that he had chosen were about 16, 17 miles away from their family home. And she wanted him to be closer to home, just in case something happened. She didn't like him being away from home so much. He would often stay over at his studio. And so she said, can't you find a studio that's closer to home? He took this very literally, and this is that house I showed you earlier that he built for his mother in 1923. He built this studio in the backyard of his mother's home there in Fort Thomas. And in fact, there are 3 structures that Hubbard designed and built on this property. 2 of them are family homes, and 1 is this studio. This studio is really incredible. It's very beautiful. I'm actually going to be doing an event at this property next Saturday on May 24th. That's an open studio event where you can come and check out all of these structures that are on the property. It's a really cool opportunity. But this studio has a lot. You'll see a structure later on in a little bit in this presentation. This structure has a lot of the features that will be important in the home that he built in Payne Hollow in Trimble County, Kentucky. And a lot of those features are this huge window here in the front of the structure, really beautiful rough-hewn masonry on the base of the structure, and then almost everything in this structure is recycled or repurposed from other structures. So he was already using this idea of pulling from other people's discards to create something beautiful and unique. And so now we find ourselves back where we were at the beginning of the presentation, at the beginning of the book. We're in the late 1930s. I've established to you why Harlan was dissatisfied, why he was frustrated, his career wasn't going well, he's still living with his mom. Things are not so great until he meets a woman named Anna. Anna Eichenhout was a librarian who worked at the Fine Arts Library over in Cincinnati. And Harlan would go to the Fine Arts Library in Cincinnati often to do research for his painting, to do research just to take out books and read, also to take out music. Harlan was a violinist, and so he enjoyed to take out music from that library so he could continue to hone that craft. When this librarian named Anna found out that he was a musician, they had already bonded over literature and poetry and art. She found out that he was a musician, and she said, why don't we play music together? Which of course was what it sounded like. It turned into a love affair that then turned into a beautiful marriage. And the bedrock of that courtship and that marriage was, in many ways, the music that they would play together. It was an important part of their coming together and an important part of their romance. One of my favorite quotes that Harlan makes of his wife, Anna, he says, Anna was a wonderful accompanist. It was her strongest point. She never lost her place, and she never lost me, which is very sweet. And here's Harlan and Anna around when they started dating. It's important to note that, of course, they were both in their 40s when they met. Neither of them had been married before, but both of them had just gotten out of really difficult relationships with people who were already married to other people. So Harlan had been in a really tumultuous relationship with one of the married friends, actually of his mother, a younger married friend of his mother. Anna had been in a relationship with a photographer from Cincinnati who was also married, but was sort of a bohemian, had sort of this open relationship kind of situation going on. And he broke her heart, and she was devastated. And then she had a terrible medical issue that caused her to have a full hysterectomy in her 40s. And so she was having a rough time when she met Harlan. And we already knew Harlan was having a rough time. So both of them were ready for a new adventure. They were ready to have an infusion of excitement, an infusion of adventure. But of course, there was still the issue of Harlan's mother. Harlan's mother was still living at the early years of their courtship. And she still depended on her son for everything. She did not have a good relationship with Anna in her final years. I think she saw her as a little bit of a competition for her in terms of time and resources. Nevertheless, Harlan and Anna decided to elope and get married. And on April 20th, they came here to Maysville, Kentucky. And Maysville, they thought, was one of the most beautiful river towns all along the Ohio River, of course. We're all biased here, so, but they thought it was one of the most beautiful river towns. They loved the community there, and they found it a very romantic place. And so they ended up coming back here and got married in the courthouse, had a lovely picnic along the railroad while they were waiting for the train to take them back to Fort Thomas. But Harlan and Anna's romantic story has a very important place here in Maysville, which is special. But when they returned to Fort Thomas, they decided they were going to live in this studio. That's a small studio. That's a pretty small studio. They decided they were going to live in this studio while Harlan's mother was still living, so that they could be close by, take care of her, but also have a little bit of their, newlywed time. They could be separated from her a little bit. And this was a time when they were experimenting with what they thought their next chapter was. Rose was very ill, so they knew she was not going to be around for that much longer, and they were trying to figure out what they wanted to do. What they knew they didn't want to do was move into that house and live in Fort Thomas for the rest of their lives. But something that had been interesting to both of them for a long time was the idea of, we think of the tiny house movement these days, of trying to live with less. That idea of Walden was still very, very much ingrained in the way Harlan was thinking about his future, and certainly in the way that Harlan and Anna were talking about their future together. And so they started experimenting while they were living here in the studio with living in this small space, with making do with less, with foraging, making, or growing everything that they possibly could to subsist on in their life. And here they also took great pleasure in some of the pastimes that would be important for their relationship throughout the rest of their lives. They loved to read aloud to one another. That was a really important part of their intimacy with one another. And of course, they loved to play music together. And even though this is a very small space, Anna had an upright piano that she said, "I will have it. I will have the upright piano in this space." So they gave over much needed space to her upright piano so they could play together. Now, Rose died on November 16th, 1943. So just a few months after Harlan and Anna got married in Maysville. And it was a really complicated moment for Harlan, of course, because even though he was proud to have been this dutiful son, to have cared for his mother, This was the first time since she was 21 years old that he could really make some choices for himself. And of course, he was making these choices with a woman who was much more compatible to his way of thinking, to his vision for the future than his mother ever was, certainly, and that was Anna. And only a few years earlier to meeting Anna, he had written in his journal, "The only life I can honorably follow is one no woman could accept." And yet there was Anna accepting it, which was great. And I mentioned Anna was ready for some adventure too, and so she decided that she was going to encourage them to take a big leap and to do something that Harlan had wanted to do since he was a little boy, exploring the river with his brothers and going and seeing those crazy shantyboat communities along the river. And she said, "Now is the time, Harlan, that we're going to build a shantyboat that you can live on." And so Harlan and Anna in the 1940s decided they were going to build a shantyboat and live on it. They decided to do that at a place called Brent, which is right along the river road there below Fort Thomas. Now there's a big interstate interchange there, so there's not really anything to see there, but it was in that area where there was already an established community of shantyboaters there. And even though both of them would have been very familiar with seeing shantyboats their entire life on the Ohio River, they knew they were going to need a lot of help with this venture because this was a pretty unusual choice to be making, particularly because most people who were shantyboaters were not shantyboaters by choice. Most people who lived in shantyboats were driven there, either by poverty or by some sort of other social exclusion, whether they were former criminals and they couldn't get a job, whether they were people of color who were having trouble finding assimilation in the regular communities and needed to find cheap housing. Shantyboaters didn't pay taxes at this point, so it was an incentive to be able to have an affordable lifestyle in a home-like environment, but one that could move when the authorities came around. So shantyboaters didn't exactly have a great reputation in river communities because they were often places where the marginalized lived. And so lots of Harlan and Anna's friends were looking askance, saying, "You want to go live with them? You want to go live with the rabble? Why do you want to do that? You have this lovely house in Fort Thomas. Why don't you want to live in Fort Thomas?" But of course, Harlan and Anna saw the idea of living as shantyboaters as an achievement of an American ideal, as the American pioneer spirit, of something that was so much more than just the desperation that had traditionally been associated with shantyboat culture. These are images of Harlan and Anna building their shantyboat on the riverbank. You can see down here, they were right across from Old Coney Island there in Cincinnati. So they actually talk about being able on 4th of July, 1943, watching the fireworks at Coney Island and hearing the calliopes of the River Queen, and while they're working on their boat. And they lived in a really rough campsite there while they were putting this boat together, and then here's what the boat looked like when they finally finished building it. And they lived there on this boat, tied up at Brent in this shantyboat community for 2 full years. And they were getting all of these wonderful tips about foraging and fishing and canning and doing these kinds of things that were essential to building a life on a shantyboat from these other shantyboaters who were living in this community. But the draw of building a shantyboat for them, of course, had been the idea of drifting like driftwood down the river. And they had a great desire to have an adventure where they would go all the way from where they were in Brent, near Cincinnati, down the Ohio, down the Mississippi River, all the way to the Gulf. And that's what they did. They spent the next 6 years drifting on the river. And their life had a wonderful rhythm to it. Here's a very sweet picture of Harlan with a litter of puppies. They had a number of dogs with them on the shanty boat over the years. This is the first litter of puppies that their puppy Skipper had. Skipper had 9 litters of puppies during the shanty boat. So she got around at the port, but this is a very sweet picture of her first litter of puppies. But they had this rhythm to their life over the next 6 years. This is a beautiful watercolor of their shanty boat moored along the river, and this is a view of the interior of their shanty boat, where they had custom-built furniture, and they had a stove, and they had bees and a beehive out back. Really lovely. But their rhythm was during high water, when the water was moving quickly. They had no motor on this shanty boat, so during high water, when the water was moving quickly in the winter and early spring, they would drift, and they would make their way down the river. And then when the water started to go down in the late spring, early summer, they would find a place that they liked, find a place where they could talk a landowner into letting them tie up on the riverbank. They would plant a garden, and they would stay there until harvest time, when they would then harvest their garden. They would can all of the fish that they had caught. They would can the groundhogs they had killed. They would can they would can the American groundnuts and the onions they had grown, and all of these incredible things that were then their provisions for their next winter of drifting. And then they would stop again. So it was a really beautiful rhythm that they had to their life. And of course, in between their day-to-day tasks of maintaining the boat and making sure that they weren't getting crushed by ice flows, that was always a problem. They also could take joy from their common hobbies. So they would read together on the shanty boat. They had their little library on the shanty boat. They would play music together. Anna did not take her upright piano on the shanty boat. She did, however, learn to play the cello and master it. She was very skilled as a musician. And so they would play cello and violin or viola together. And then, of course, Harlan would sketch and paint from the shanty boat, sometimes while they were drifting, sometimes while he's wandering around in the landscape wherever they happened to be along the Ohio and Mississippi River. So this grand shanty boat epic, of course, ended after they took a little sojourn through the Intracoastal Waterway and the bayous. And then they reached the port of New Orleans on April 7th, 1951. This was just a few weeks shy of their 9th wedding anniversary. So the first 9 years of their marriage together were spent on this incredible shanty boat adventure, which is pretty incredible. But they decided that they really wanted to put down roots somewhere now. And they were feeling called back to Kentucky. And at this point, it was the beginning of 1952 when they returned to Kentucky, and they kept thinking about this place where they had spent their first shanty boat summer. And this was a place across from Madison, Indiana, in Trimble County, Kentucky, that was called Payne's Landing. And it was this beautiful hollow there that they would take to calling Payne Hollow. And they decided to return there, where they had loved the people they had met, they loved the landscape, and see what it felt like to try putting down some roots there. At the same time, in the beginning of 1952 into 1953, Harlan had also decided that, boy, this adventure would make a great book, wouldn't it? And this ambition that he had long had to write a book found its fruition in a tale about their great shanty boat journey called Shanty Boat. Harlan's brother, Frank, who of course was an illustrator in New York still, helped him find a publisher in New York, Dodd Mead, and Dodd Mead published Shanty Boat with hand illustrations that Harlan had done of their journey. This is an incredible adventure story. If you love river adventures, please read Shanty Boat, it's wonderful. So they were working on publishing Shanty Boat, but of course they also needed a new home. They had been camping at Payne's Landing, Payne Hollow, but they decided after they had a little bit of a snafu where some local folks stole some of their tools and stuff out of an old tobacco barn they were staying in. They said, boy, we really need a house. We better build a house. But they wanted to still maintain the shantyboat spirit that they had developed during the first 9 years of their marriage. So they built this itty bitty little cabin here that was not much bigger, of course, than the Fort Thomas studio, not much bigger than their shantyboat cabin. And by the way, this is the view from that house. It's a pretty nice view, pretty good. And Madison, Indiana is up here. Just to give you some perspective, this is a few miles downstream from Madison. But they built this little house and purchased 7 acres and spent their first Christmas at Payne Hollow celebrating the new house and the publication of Shantyboat. It was pretty good year, pretty good Christmas. But of course, they realized that they could still keep the shantyboat ethos while also making room for some things that they also still wanted to have in their home. Anna missed her piano. She missed her piano a lot. So initially, in 1954, they made an expansion to that cabin out toward the front to make room for some of these other necessities, including a piano. The piano you're seeing here is the piano that ended up down there. They first started with that upright piano, but 2 pianos had to be hauled into Payne Hollow. Payne Hollow is a very steep hollow. You picture that, I don't know what the road is it Lexington Road that goes crazy up the hill? That's the road into Payne Hollow, right? And it's not a driving road. It's an old county road that, like, carts used to go down and tractors could go down. So they used a tractor to haul in not one, but then this Steinway Baby Grand into Payne Hollow. This home that they built at Payne Hollow, too, it's important to note, had no electricity, had no plumbing. They were almost completely self-sufficient there at this home. So this whole idea that they had been cultivating since they were at the Fort Thomas studio of being more self-sufficient, of living off of what they could grow, forage, barter, or kill, is basically how they were living here. They did keep goats. Harlan hated chickens, so they did not keep chickens. They fished. They had beautiful gardens. They're standing here in the bottomlands where they had a large garden where they often had sunflowers and corn growing, but they had terraced gardens going up toward their house up the hollow that were beautiful, and they had cold frames that they would use in the winter to grow radishes and greens during the cold weather months. Really incredible. And all of the visitors who would come to Payne Hollow, because people were starting to be interested in this interesting life that these people were living now in Trimble County. There were lots of visitors, especially visitors from my alma mater, Hanover College, who were coming over, curious students, curious professors. Professors started bringing their students as part of classes, talking about American utopias, talking about American philosophy and transcendentalism, about literature, about music. All of these visitors were struck by this really practical demonstration of a set of values that really seemed very remarkable and unfamiliar by the mid-1950s. You know, the mid-1950s, things were booming in industrialization, things were booming in the international expansion of the markets. The rat race was in high, in high, whatever the word is I'm looking for. Yeah, and absolutely gear. Gear is a great word because it's so mechanical. So Harlan and Anna were living in this way that was a complete antithesis of what most people were experiencing in 1950s Kentucky. Certainly. And this concept of this modern Walden led to Harlan's next book project. That's a book called Payne Hollow, named after the home that they built for one another. That came out in 1973, 1974, right around the time that the Back to the Land movement was really starting to gather momentum in the United States, and people were looking for books like Payne Hollow, to learn how to live alternative lifestyles. And Harlan, of course, still wanted to paint. That original structure that I showed you at Payne Hollow of the home was only one of 3 structures that they built down there in the hollow. This is a studio and workshop that Harlan built for himself. Took a lot of tools to make their life at Payne Hollow work, so he had this whole bottom part was devoted just to a wonderful workshop where he could store, he had probably 20 sides that are still there, 20 sides, all kinds of incredible tools to help him maintain the garden, maintain the house, build boats, wonderful things that would maintain their life there. But he also wanted a studio still there, and he was still painting, still experimenting. And by now, he was achieving some moderate success in his painting. Part of this came from a synthesis into his really most mature and remarkable style. To me, that is absolutely represented by this. These are 3 paintings of a 5-painting series that he did about the history of Owensboro. These are in the collection of the Owensboro Museum of Fine Art. And these are huge. These are 5 by 8 feet. Really incredible. And he sort of synthesized the work that he was doing in oils, which were sort of realist with a little bit of impressionism, with the work he had been doing in watercolors. And you remember in some of those watercolors I showed you, he had those black outlines around everything, and it was a little expressionistic and a little bit more free. And this is the kind of style that was really getting attraction. This 5-piece series, for example, was a commission from a bank in Owensboro that netted him a good amount of money. And of course, at this point, Harlan and Anna didn't really need money because they were self-sufficient. So they were bankrolling this. They had a pretty nice savings by the time they died. So here's Harlan and Anna toward the end of their lives at Payne Hollow. They were able to live this life, this self-sufficient lifestyle in this place with no electricity, no plumbing, growing their own food, into their 80s. Really incredible. They were incredibly strong and creative people to be able to live a life like this. It's important to give a shout out to Anna, because Anna is often overlooked as the non-creative person in this relationship. Anna had to be supremely creative because she was someone who made their life at Payne Hollow work. She made that home work. She kept them healthy. She kept them eating nutritious food. She was making recipes that could make use of groundhog and American groundnut. That's not something you're necessarily taught in home ec. So she was trying to keep this lifestyle. She was keeping their laundry clean and crisp and beautiful. She was hosting a constant stream of visitors and curious onlookers who wanted to check out this crazy couple that lived in Trimble County. So Anna was absolutely essential to maintaining this life, to Harlan achieving his dreams. If Anna had not come along in the 1940s, I don't know what we would have seen from Harlan. Certainly, Harlan did wonderful things, and I've written a book about him. But Harlan would not have been possible without Anna, and that's a really important thing to note. There's a wonderful biography that's been written about Anna called Out of the Shadows that you should check out if you would like to read more about her. And Harlan and Anna, like I said, they continued to live at Payne Hollow into their 80s, and they're still at Payne Hollow because after they passed away, Anna passed away in 1986, Harlan passed away in 1988. Their remains were cremated and they were buried there at their beloved Payne Hollow. This is their headstone that's still there. And this is an opportunity just to tell you a little bit about what's happening there at Payne Hollow now. So Payne Hollow was willed to a man named Paul Hasfurter, who had helped Harlan and Anna out at the property doing some of the harder labor as Harlan was getting older, like chopping wood. The Herculean amount of wood chopping that had to happen at Payne Hollow in order to keep them warm and keep them fed was incredible. So wood chopping alone would probably kill many of us in this room at Payne Hollow. But so Paul Hassfurter inherited the land and the homes, and then a few years ago I was part of a group called Payne Hollow on the Ohio, and that's what this postcard gives you some information about. That group was founded to purchase that property from Paul Hassfurter, to restore the structures, to do land surveys, understanding the ecological assets that are there at Payne Hollow, which are manifold, and to start building that legacy of what Payne Hollow can be for the future and how the Hubbard example can spill over into the Trimble County community and other communities around it. As an example for sustainable living, for living creatively and beautifully, for supporting art and the humanities. So if you want to learn more about that organization, definitely check this out. But I mentioned I would come back to this painting at the end of the presentation. And the reason I come back to this painting is, you remember, before I ever knew who Harlan Hubbard was, I was drawn into this painting. And of course it has a beautiful composition that naturally draws you into the center because of that beautiful river. But what I didn't know at the time was right here in the center of the composition, that's where Payne Hollow is. Payne Hollow is right in the center in the view of that painting that I have been staring at for all those years behind the circulation desk. And it, of course, is a place that has changed my life, changed so many other people's lives, and has certainly changed my career in very significant ways. So that journey has been fascinating, and I'm glad to have gotten to share some of that with you today. You've been an awesome, very patient audience. I've definitely gone over my time, so I'm so sorry. But if you want to learn more about the projects related to Driftwood, I have a website that gives you information about exhibits related to this, more information about the book, and more resources to learn more about Payne Hollow and different places like that. Okay.
Are you open to questions now?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
questions, please.
For about the last year and a half, I mean, it's the first time I mentioned it, but for about the last year and a half, I've been photographing different areas of northern Kentucky because I feel like Cincinnati is so over-photographed and northern Kentucky's kind of left out. So my question is, I mean, I'll get out like Fort Thomas and just walk around, but I've never been to the back. My question is, doing all that, how come I've never heard of Harlan Hubbard before?
That was certainly the question I asked.
Is there any signage around anywhere?
So, I don't know if it's been approved. I won't know if it's been approved until later this year, but the first historic marker for Harlan Hubbard is hopefully going to go up in Milton, Kentucky this year.
So there is none?
I hope.
Right now?
There is none.
Okay.
Harlan, this is one of the great paradoxes of the Harlan Hubbard story and of the Hubbard story in general. These were remarkable people who were doing remarkable things, but were doing so devoid of ego and so removed. They called it on the fringe of society, the life that they were living at Payne Hollow, that so much of what they were experiencing was not being promoted hugely within the nation, even within communities.
Can you get to that little studio? I mean, is it still there? Can you still get to it, or will you be arrested for trespassing if you try?
Okay, so so all of the structures that are related to the Hubbards, so the Fort Thomas studio, which I think is what you're talking about. Yes. The Fort Thomas studio, I mentioned there's an open studio event that's next Saturday. They occasionally do those open studio events. The studio is on the Historic Register and it is managed by the Fort Thomas Forest Conservancy, but it is on private land. That house is privately owned. So the time when you can go see that studio is when they have these open studio events. So I would recommend, if you can come next Saturday, awesome, but they'll have future events in the, that you can come to as well, when you can check out that structure. And if you follow the Fort Thomas Forest Conservancy online, they're on Facebook and Instagram, that'll keep you plugged in. Payne Hollow, if you get on their, the Payne Hollow on the Ohio mailing list, I do their newsletters, so I'll see you come through if you sign up for the newsletter. But in that newsletter, we'll tell you when there are community work days which you can engage in, where you can go down into the hollow and visit Payne Hollow, when you can do open houses where you can visit Payne Hollow. But currently, that's still under restoration, so it is an active work site, so it's not open to the public right now. But we hope that soon, when that work is done, there will be a plan for making that open to the public.
Can you see it from like the road or public?
Not really,
road?
no.
No, it's a hike down.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a mile into the hollow, and then it's pretty well wooded along the riverbank. So even though there is river access, you won't be able to see it very easily.
It is in Kentucky though, or is it in Indiana?
It's in Trimble County.
Okay.
Yep, Trimble County, Northern Kentucky. I mentioned Madison, Indiana as the reference point because that's normally the city that people will recognize when I say it's in that area. But yeah, it's near Milton. It's in the P.O. Box area of Milton.
Are there perennials and gardens there that are still like they planted?
Yes, but what's really, really special is how much it's clear they have cultivated different native occurring foraging crops, and how they clearly were caretaking the naturally occurring native plants that were in the area, as well as doing their own cultivation of non-natives.
See, like just like right there, right? With maybe some of the only places that those plants are.
Correct. So on the Payne Hollow website, we just did a landscape inventory there at Payne Hollow. It is incredible. There's also a full tree survey that was done of Payne Hollow. There are some incredible historic trees that are at Payne Hollow. They're also incredible. It's one of the largest communities of sugar maples in northern Kentucky, which is really incredible. All the spring ephemerals, if there are opportunities to hike down into Payne Hollow during early spring, the spring ephemerals, native plants like Dutchman's breeches and trillium, those are absolutely gorgeous in Payne Hollow this time of year. And there's a natural spring there, there are sinkholes, there are all kinds of geological formations that are special to the area. You can read about some of those special formations on the Payne Hollow website and those reports that are on there. But yeah, it's a really special place, and there's lots of talk about maybe it becoming a nature preserve at some point because it needs to be protected. Any other questions? Yeah.
In the 80s, there was a pilot, one of the river pilots, might have been with the Delta Queen, brought him up. I used to know the Augusta Ferry.
Oh, cool. Very cool.
And brought him up for a visit.
Yeah.
And he ended up giving a painting to this guy.
Yeah.
And it was painted on a piece of tin off of his shop. And it hung in my house for 3 years. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, those paintings on tin were a big deal for Harlan. He loved painting on tin, and that was one of his favorite materials to take along with him when he was on canoe trips. He would do lots of oil paintings on tin, and then of course lots of watercolors, literally using the Ohio River water as part of his watercolor compositions. Really beautiful. Yeah.
So when I think of Kentucky writers who wrote about sustainability, the first person that comes to mind is my book.
Oh yeah.
Who probably was a young man, I'm guessing, when Harlan Hubbard was living. Do you know if they knew each other?
Oh yes. So the very first biography of Harlan Hubbard was written by Wendell Berry. It's a small volume and it's very impressionistic, but it's beautiful. So definitely check that out. It's called Life and Work, Harlan Hubbard Life and Work. And they actually met by chance. Wendell Berry was on a canoe trip with a friend in the 70s, and they had run out of drinking water, and they said, well, let's stop at this house and go get some water from them, ask them for some water. And it was Payne Hollow and Harlan and Anna Hubbard. So they became very close friends. Tanya Berry actually did one of the typescripts for one of Harlan's later books, Shantyboat on the Bayous. So they remained close friends. Wendell Berry certainly remained an important advocate for Harlan's legacy and remains certainly an important companion writer to this kind of ethos, for sure. Yeah. Great question. Any other questions? Well, you guys have been great. Thank you so much. I'm happy to answer other questions if you have them, but